Alright, this is going to be Chapter 7, the Muscular System, and this is going to be Part 2. Okay, alright, I'm ready now. 5.0, the energetics and muscle activity. So these are terms, and as we kind of go down them here, I'll try to explain them best I can. If you have questions, please use our class meeting times to address those. ATP and CP reserves, or adenosine triphosphate and creatine phosphate reserves. Primary function of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is to transfer energy from one location to another. Now we're going to see that all cells, instead of the oxygen or sugar or whatever you're thinking right now, run off of something called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. All the cells do. ATP transfers energy to creatinine, and creatinine is another kind of high energy compound that makes something called creatine phosphate. And this is regulated by an enzyme called CPK, or creatine phosphokinase. When muscles are damaged, CPK leaks into the bloodstream. Now, we used to use this as an indicator, the specific one that was generated by the heart, for heart damage. We don't use it like that so much anymore. A CPK level, any muscle damage. So if the person got hit with lightning, CPK would be liberated. What we use now is something called troponin, or cardiac troponin, and it will specifically look to see if the cardiac muscle cell has got injured, and if it has got injured, did it liberate it into the bloodstream? And then that's what we look for. Another term here at the bottom, ATP generation, and the areas that we need to know about this are, if I say aerobic, I mean with oxygen. Aerobic, air, means with oxygen, and anaerobic means without oxygen. So if a muscle goes into anaerobic metabolism, that means that it went into a metabolism state to where it no longer has the ability to tap into oxygen. And aerobic metabolism means with oxygen. So if we're breathing appropriately and moving gases in and out of our muscle cells like we should, then we should be creating sufficient enough energy. What we'll also see here later on is when the cell goes anaerobic, or without oxygen, it makes less energy. So that kind of puts us in a cellular bankruptcy. 5.1, aerobic metabolism. And this is with oxygen, provides 95% of ATP requirements in resting cells. And ATP, again, is for adenosine triphosphate. Essential nutrients are carbon, oxygen, adenosine diphosphate, and we learned in one of the slides that we essentially change adenosine diphosphate, which is 2, to adenosine triphosphate, which is 3. So we rotate that phosphate group through pretty much, and work in phosphate groups as energy packets, so to speak, in the cellular environment. Phosphate, ADP, phosphates, and then small organic substrates are utilized as essential nutrients. The Krebs cycle pretty much disassembles fatty acids and proteins and will give us energy. It does have byproducts. The byproducts are essentially CO2, pyruvic acid, and water. So normal cellular metabolism, if we have oxygen and the Krebs cycle is utilized, it pretty much has a production or an output of CO2 and water, which we have plenty of at all times. And we can make pyruvic acid if we kind of stress the cellular environment itself, especially in the muscles. 17 ATP molecules are produced. Glycolysis, which means the breakdown of sugar, or the breakdown of glucose to pyruvic acid. And this is anaerobic metabolism. So with oxygen, we tap into fats, proteins, and whatnot to make ATP quite easily. Whenever we are without oxygen, or go into an anaerobic state of metabolism, for cells to get energy, what they do is they break down sugar. And when the sugar is broken down and into pyruvic acid, whenever it's in excess because it can't move it back out due to the fact that it has no oxygen, it will make a byproduct. The byproduct is lactic acid. Alright, so in a resting muscle, and we're going to kind of talk through this. This is a resting skeletal muscle fiber, and it pretty much relies on aerobic metabolism, or with oxygen, and the metabolism of fatty acids to make ATP, and fatty acids are also absorbed into this from the circulation to facilitate this. Alright, so let's kind of go through this. Fatty acids here are absorbed into the muscle cells, and they're with oxygen. This is the most important thing. This is a resting muscle. Whenever we bring the glucose in for later on, what we'll do is we'll store it in chains called glycogen. We will create ATP, and creatinine will be produced as a byproduct and make something called creatine phosphate. And this is all because of the mitochondria, or the energy house of the cell, and its ability to use oxygen, metabolizing fatty acids, and making all the nutrients that we need. And we actually will produce an excess of this in this environment, and this is an aerobic or with oxygen environment. And then we have under moderate activity. Now, under moderate activity, we start breaking down our stores. Contracting skeletal muscle fibers is what this shows here. Mitochondria break down pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid is provided through glycolysis. So not only do we have oxygen, not only are we metabolizing the fatty acids that are coming in to the mitochondria, and this is still aerobic, which means with oxygen, we also start breaking down our stores that we might have had in excess. Now this is going to produce pyruvic acid. Now, the byproduct of this, if this continues on, we're going to see later on, whenever we cannot tap into the oxygen or go into an anaerobic state of metabolism, we'll actually make some nasty byproducts off of this. And this is what makes the muscle cells, or the muscles, appear sore or inflamed, is because of what's called a lactic acid buildup. So this still is with oxygen, and this is under moderate activity. And 5.4, during peak activity. Now, under peak activity, the muscles get so excited and so engorged and so worked that they can no longer tap into oxygen supplies that are actually in the vascular system. So periods of peak activity, oxygen pretty much cannot diffuse through the muscle fibers fast enough, and the mitochondria cannot produce required ATP. Now, only about 1/3 of the ATP needed is actually produced in this. Glycolysis becomes the primary source of ATP, which means all the stores that we had once before in the glycogen form are broken down. We get pyruvic acid, and whenever we start accumulating pyruvic acid in this muscle cell, it will convert it. It converts it to what's called lactic acid, so it can expel it out of the muscular environment. Now, what this does is this will change our acid base for the whole body whenever we go into an anaerobic metabolism. Now, this right here is without oxygen. So this entire peak activity, we do not have the ability to get oxygen in our skeletal muscle, and we go into something called an anaerobic metabolism. 5.5, more terms. This is glycolysis, which means the breakdown of sugar. Glycolysis is obtained from glycogen reserves in the sarcoplasm, and this is going to be the fluid in the muscle cell itself. Just like we learned about cytoplasm in the cell, the sarcoplasm is the fluid in muscle cells. Glycogen is a polysaccharide, which means a big, gigantic sugar molecule. It's chains of sugar molecules. Large glycogen reserves in the skeletal muscle. They have insoluble granules, which they are insoluble granules, and they're broken down by an enzyme when ATP levels drop. So at the point that the ATP or the energy levels drop, what the body does is it will tap into the glycogen stores. And once it taps into those glycogen stores, that is an anaerobic state of metabolism, and generally without oxygen towards the peak activity. And what we'll get is we'll get nasty byproducts. Pyruvic acid to lactic acid. Lactic acid gets liberated into the vasculature, and then this changes the overall acid base unless it's put to a stop, either by the return of normal metabolism, the return of oxygen, or the decrease in activity. Energy use and the level of muscle activity. So peak activity, oxygen cannot diffuse fast enough through the cellular environment. Glycolysis becomes the primary source of ATP. Drawbacks of anaerobic metabolism. Glycolysis produces pyruvic acid faster than it's used. Pyruvic acid levels rise in the sarcoplasm or the fluid, and pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid. And then once this is liberated, this can kind of throw a monkey wrench into the whole cellular environment. Lactic acid conversion, and this is an organic acid, and what we essentially get is it disassociates into a hydrogen ion and a lactate ion, and this is the guy that's going to give us problems right here. Hydrogen ions accumulate. Now pH is hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. So the more hydrogen ion that we have, the lower the pH goes and the more acidic that we become. Muscle fibers cannot continue to contract whenever there are high levels of hydrogen and lactic ion or lactic acid. Glycolysis, inefficient method of ATP production. During anaerobic metabolism, one glucose generates two pyruvic acids. Converted to lactic acid, cell gains two ATP molecules. Now here's the difference, and this won't take a math professor to figure this out. Whenever you're in an anaerobic state of metabolism, you produce a net gain of 2 ATP molecules. Whenever you're in an aerobic metabolism, or with oxygen, you produce 34 ATP molecules. Now which one is going to produce you or get you bank faster? And the answer is aerobic metabolism. And this right here is what is called the Krebs cycle. Now the Krebs cycle is a representation of what occurs in the actual production of ATP. So this up top here, glucose to pyruvic acid, and then we get lactic acid and pyruvic acid that are changing back again from lactic acid into pyruvic acid, or pyruvic acid if there's a buildup into lactic acid. And this all occurs in an anaerobic metabolism, or whenever the body taps into glucose for its energy use instead of an oxygenated or an aerobic environment. This down here, however, is an aerobic environment, or with oxygen. This occurs in the mitochondria. So what this means is the mitochondria pretty much requires oxygen. Fatty acids and amino acids, or fats and proteins, are broken down, and we have a net production of energy in the form of ATP. We still produce some hydrogen atoms, but not enough to mess up or throw a monkey wrench into the overall acid-base derangement of the body. So again, this is figure 7.9 in your book in muscle metabolism. So quick review over this one more time. Resting muscle state in an aerobic environment with oxygen. We essentially throw fatty acids and oxygen into the mitochondria, and we get ATP, which gets us creatine and phosphate, another high energy source. If we have excess glucose, we store it in the form of glycogen in the muscle cell itself. During moderate activity, whenever we're tapping into our stores, not only are we using the fatty acids and the oxygen to create ATP molecules, a good amount of them, 34, we're also tapping into glycogen stores, making it glucose, getting pyruvic acid, so we're having a few byproducts off of this, but this is under moderate activity whenever we're really working our muscles. And last but not least is peak activity, and this is the point to where we can no longer diffuse oxygen. So this is without oxygen, this last one. And if we'll notice here, we're not bringing in fatty acids anymore, we're not bringing in oxygen. We're essentially tapping into the glycogen stores, making glycolysis, breaking down glucose, which makes pyruvic acid. This nets us 2 ATP molecules. When we get a high concentration of pyruvic acid, it will generate lactic acid, which gives us hydrogen ion and lactate ion, and it will expel it into the system, which gives us a bunch of hydrogen ion molecule. This hydrogen ion molecule then will change the overall pH. So if a person had a pH of 7.35 before they started this, after this, if the ABG was checked, it would be something like a 7.1 or 7.0. This would be an acidic environment. Muscle fatigue, 5.9. Caused by exhaustion of the energy reserves, fatigue will not occur until glycogen and other reserves such as lipids and amino acids, fats and proteins are depleted. And an example of this is going to be marathon runners. So marathon runners will go pretty much to the edge. And what happens is they just go into complete fatigue, which their muscles can no longer supply energy. So they essentially go into a cellular bankruptcy and collapse. ATP, provided by glycolysis, increase lactic acid levels and lower the pH. And we just talked about this. And the muscles can no longer function. So whenever we reduce the pH or make a person acidic, a lot of things don't work. Proteins don't work. Proteins denature. The acidic level itself will stop the muscles from functioning. Now, the problem with this is we have to have one muscle to function all the time, which is the heart. The recovery period, 5.10. When a muscle fiber contracts, conditions in the sarcoplasm are changed. Energy reserves are consumed, heat is released, and lactic acid may be produced. During the recovery period, conditions within the muscle are returned to normal pre-exertion levels. Now, what this does in this recovery period is put things back to where they were before. So if you were in an anaerobic environment, no oxygen in the muscle cell, and you've created a bunch of pyruvic acid from the glycolysis, or the breakdown of glycogen and glucose into energy, which made pyruvic acid. This is going to spit out a byproduct known as lactic acid. And this is all from an anaerobic environment without oxygen. This lactic acid will build up, but during the time that you decrease and have a recovery period for the muscles, what happens is this is all thrown in reverse. Lactic acid comes back in, is made into pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid is used by the cells. We go into an aerobic state of metabolism again. 34 ATP molecules are produced, and everyone is happy. You are no longer in cellular bankruptcy. But this takes a little while, and it takes a period of rest. Figure 5.11, or I'm sorry, 5.11, figure 7.10 in your book. And this is cardiac and smooth muscle. Now, we've talked about three types of muscle. We have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Now, smooth muscle is absolutely autonomic, and that's this guy here on the bottom. And there's no picture of skeletal muscle in here. This one at the top is cardiac muscle, and it has some special features. Now, if we'll look at this, all of this muscle, this isn't striated. Skeletal muscle is very striated, as we've seen in the previous section. This right here kind of looks like an offspring, and I like to always use this terminology that the smooth muscle and the skeletal muscle got together and they had a child, and the child was the cardiac muscle. This has some striations in it. It has something very special called, these are intercalated discs, and these allow entire regions to contract simultaneously. So in the heart, that's very important. It does have autonomic features. We cannot stop our heart if we're thinking about it. So again, it has features of the smooth muscle, it has features of the skeletal muscle, but it's something all to its own, which is, and the answer is it's cardiac muscle. Thing is, with cardiac muscle, has intercalated discs, does have some striations, and it does respond to autonomic signaling. Lactic acid recycling. The reaction that converts pyruvic acid to lactic acid is freely reversible. So this is a reversible reaction during the recovery period when oxygen is available. Lactic acid can be recycled by converting it back into pyruvic acid. Now this can be rerun through the cell again in the mitochondria and produce our ATP molecules from pyruvic acid. 5.13, which is heat loss. Contraction generates heat and warms things. So without muscles and without their muscular contraction, we would be awful cold. Muscle contraction plays an important part in the maintaining of body heat. Matter of fact, one of the triggers that you get if you get too cold is you'll start to shiver. And the shivering is the movement of muscles by your autonomic nervous system to generate heat. 6.0, muscle performance. Muscle performance can be considered in the terms of force, which is the maximum amount of tension produced by a particular muscle or muscle group. and endurance, which is the amount of time over which the individual can perform a particular activity. Example of this: if you were trying to run farther, you would have to get your muscles into an aerobic state of conditioning. And what that means is to continuously utilize the oxygen that you're supplying it and be able to maintain a specific level of performance. Types of skeletal muscle fibers. There are fast fibers and slow fibers. The fast fibers can contract in 0.01 seconds or less, and following stimulation. So like we stimulate it and it's very fast. 0.01 seconds is how fast these fibers can contract. And these are pretty much our skeletal muscles. And then we have slow fibers, which are half the diameter, so they're smaller. They can continue to contract for extended periods. And the differences of them is between the slow fibers and the fast fibers is they have more oxygen supply, more extensive network of capillaries, and oxygen supply is increased. As far as oxygen use, they can use hemoglobin, and they also have myoglobin in them, related to hemoglobin, and contains oxygen reserves. And then they have storage, larger numbers of mitochondria than the fast fibers actually do. And this is all the slow fibers. So the distribution of muscle fibers and muscle performance. We have two types of fibers. We have white muscles and red muscles. White muscles dominated by fast fibers, and these guys don't have much blood supply. They don't have the myoglobin in them, so they're kind of whitish in appearance. And then we have red muscles, and these are dominated by slow fibers, have a better blood supply, and are pretty much able to supply themselves with myoglobin, which gives them an oxygen reserve, and thereby makes them pinker or redder in appearance. Physical conditioning. Anaerobic, without oxygen endurance, is the length of time muscle contraction can be supported by glycolysis and existing energy reserves of ATP and creatine and phosphate. So this means that this is the maximum amount of time without any other source of oxygen and you feeding ATP into the problem that your muscles can react. And another term on here, the term is called hypertrophy, which pretty much means enlargement of the muscle. So if you work a muscle, what you're going to get is you're going to get hypertrophy of that muscle. Now an example of this is if we do curls, our biceps are going to get bigger. Aerobic endurance is the length of time a muscle can continue to contract while being supported by mitochondrial activities, and this is with oxygen, since we are talking about mitochondrial activities. 7.0 Cardiac and smooth muscle tissues. Cardiac and smooth muscle are both autonomic, and cardiac is only found in the heart, and smooth muscle is pretty much in autonomic places, and this means automatic places. Example of this is going to be our vessels that constrict and dilate, our intestines to where we're moving food through them. So all of the smooth muscle would be autonomic muscle and pretty much react to autonomic signaling or neurotransmitters from your central nervous system. Or my apologies, the peripheral nervous system. A section of it is called the autonomic nervous system, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. That would be chapter 8. 7.1 Cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue is kind of special. It has two special things that no other muscle tissue has. One has intercalated discs, and those were those disc-looking things between the striations that we saw in the cardiac muscle in the previous slide. And it contains gap junctions, and these are under the intercalated discs, that allows the movement of ions and small molecules and rapid passage of action potentials from cell to cell. So what this refers to and what this relates to is this allows, I'm going to go back to that cardiac, there we go. See all those little areas that I drew out here? Those little lines. And I'll clear this page here really quick. Does everyone see those little lines right here? There. Those are all intercalated discs, and they allow this entire region of cells to respond very, very quickly for action potentials or contraction. And another thing that they have, and this is the cardiac muscle tissue, is they have something called pacemaker cells. And what a pacemaker cell does is it allows the timing of contractions, and they can generate their own action potentials or generate their own beat. So the heart is very responsive. Every cell in the heart has the ability to generate its own action potential or its own contraction. So if it thinks that the rest of the muscle tissues aren't doing the job that they're supposed to, any cell in the heart can take over. That's like having a million backups. That's a good thing in one way, that we have a lot of areas that we can back up, so in case something fails. The bad thing about that is this can also give us ectopic beats or funny looking beats. These funny looking beats could actually turn into something called VTAC or VFib if there's enough of them. 7.2 clinical note, and this is laboratory testing in a heart attack, and all of these up here are not used so much anymore. CK, LDH1 and 2, myoglobin levels, all of these are from the old days. CK, creatine kinase, found in muscle tissues in the brain. CKMB would be the specific cardiac fraction of this, and anything greater than 2 would indicate that they're having a heart attack. LDH1 and 2, lactate dehydrogenase. 1 is generally greater in value than 2, but in the presence of an MI, we're going to see just the opposite of that. We're going to see LDH2 being more than LDH1. And then we have myoglobin, which is damage of the cells, and it releases it into the circulation. This also is in a lot of red muscle cells, which are the slow fibers, and they contain a higher oxygen content. Troponin 1, troponin, which is cardiac troponin that we're looking for, and these are contractile proteins on the thin filament from the last slide set, and they are liberated under cardiac injury. Now what that means is during the time that we have an infarction or have a cardiac injury, that the troponin cardiac is liberated into the vasculature. This means that there has been some sort of cellular destruction in some form or fashion. And then last but not least is a BNP, or a brain natriuretic peptide. And you would think that they would find a better word for that than brain, but this is in the heart, and it's a stretch receptor that is released by the ventricles. So what a high BNP means is it means that the person is in congestive heart failure if their BNP is high. So their heart is big, it's had hypertrophy to it, and this is the myocardial tissue here, septum, left and right. So if you have a gigantic muscle wall, because of hypertrophy and hypertension, this is going to cause a stretching of this muscle tissue. If that is the case, then what you're going to get is you're going to get these stretch receptors to releasing their material. The material that they release is something called BNP, or brain natriuretic peptide. If there's a high BNP level, then that is suggestive of, gosh, the ventricles have stretched beyond their means, and this person might be in congestive heart failure. 7.3 smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle cells are similar in size to cardiac muscle cells. They also contain a single central located nucleus within each spindle-shaped cell. Pretty much smooth muscles, an example of this are going to be sphincters that are in the body. Your cardiac sphincter, which is in between your esophagus and your stomach, would be an example of this. 8.0, and this is anatomy of the muscle system. Now this part will go pretty quick. What I would like you to do in this is please go to G-Flash and download the card set for Chapter 7. This will give you muscles to look at, and not so much to look at, but it will give you description of muscles and terms and definitions that are easily run in your head through rote memorization. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. You should pretty much know the major muscle groups: sternocleidomastoid, masseter, temporalis, trapezius muscle, deltoid, pecs, biceps, triceps, brachialis, gluteus, rectus abdominis, gastrocnemius, rectus femoris, that would be about it on that page. Again, gluteus, deltoid, most of these we looked at on the previous page. Gastrocnemius, which is the calf. Okay, so again, go over those and look over the flashcards. Muscles of the head: sternocleidomastoid, masseter, occipital muscles, temporalis. Now, this is something interesting. I would like you to know what the hyoid bone is. Where your mandible is at. That should be kind of in your head from the skeletal chapter. What the hyoid bone does is it holds your entire voice box in place and allows the muscles to attach to a bone. Even though the bone is not connected, the hyoid bone is free-floating in this area and is suspended by muscles and ligaments. Alright, this is your obliques and your diaphragm and your abdominal muscles. Rectus abdominis, I would know that one. Internal and external obliques, I would know those as well. This is a scanned shot if we cut the person in half in this. This is a xiphoid process. The rectus abdominis muscles, and it kind of shows central tendon, which is in here, vena cava or esophagus, which would permeate down into the intestines, the aorta, esophagus, and this would be another shot, rectus abdominis, latissimus dorsi. This is figure 7.20. All of this area here is essentially the muscles of the perineum. I would go over and be able to identify some of those on either body part, whether it be a male or a female. Please look over both of those. Muscles of the shoulders, I would look over those too, your traps and whatnot. Deltoid, trapezius muscle, where that is, and so on. Please look over that section as well. Figure 7.27-21 in your book. Muscles of the arms, pec, we already covered some of these. Deltoid, where the sternum and the sternum, there's my pen, sternum and the clavicles are. Your bicep brachii, tricep brachii, deltoid, latissimus dorsi, muscles of the forearm, where your tricep bicep is. That would be good. Figure 7-23 are muscles of the forearm. Please look over that section as well. Gluteus maximus, how that is actually attached. Gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, and what all that would be. This is figure 7.7-24 in chapter 7. Again, this is going a little bit deeper into the leg and the buttock area. 7-25, look over those. We've already identified most of these muscles that I would like you to know in here. Figure 7.26, muscles that move the foot. Please pay attention to these. Remember that muscle relaxation is a passive thing. We generally do it by an opposing muscle set. So as you're looking at these, remember there's a movement muscle and then a muscle that would, for each action or each movement that you have an opposite movement. Clinical note, spasmodic torticollis. Spasmodic torticollis is an intermittent or continuous spasm of the muscles in the neck, most commonly the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. So this means that essentially your neck muscles that attach your head are going to spasm up and stay that way. Now that would probably be pretty painful. Continuous spasm, not just one spasm, but continuous. And clinical note, musculoskeletal back disorders. We have a problem with posture and using our back correctly. Very smart things to do. Keep the stuff closer to you whenever you're lifting it. Use your legs as much as you can. Do not use your back. The back muscles themselves, there's not that many of them. And if you strain them or injure them, they take a long time to get blood supply to them and actually repair themselves. So just be aware of that back pain and back strain are kind of a continuous thing, and they take a very long time to heal. Clinical note, which is hernias, and the inguinal region is probably the most vulnerable, and that is because we have an area here to where we have multiple muscles, and what can occur is in this thinner area, let me see if I can go back to where the perineum is. In kind of the floor of the abdomen area, in between these two is a weak area. If we'll notice, there's not that much actual abdominal muscles here. We have mostly fast fibers and some slow fibers, but if some intestine, we had a bulge there and we overworked the area and caused a thinning of that area from strain. What would be a bad thing is if some of our small intestine would come out in the inguinal muscle area that is here and protrude down into testicular sac or the perineum area. And this can happen both in a male and a female. Most generally it happens in males. If this occurs, you can strangulate this bowel, and what that means is you can cut the blood supply off to this bowel and become septic very, very rapidly. So this is a surgical fix. They're going to want to get that bowel back to where it belongs. Least invasive way as possible. If they can just push it back up in there and give you some rest for a while, they may try it like that. If it's pretty severe and you've spit a lot of intestine into that area or shot out a lot of intestine into that area, they're probably going to go in and surgically fix it. Clinical note, intramuscular drug injections, and this is in the clinical note section, 8.19 by the slides. And it's pretty safe and effective. It delivers in a time frame of about 10 to 15 minutes, and this is because the muscle cells themselves, whenever you introduce the drug into them, it diffuses into the vasculature, and then once it gets into the vasculature, it will actually hit its receptor site. So it's a good way to deliver drugs in a slower fashion over about a 10-minute time frame. 8.20, which is a clinical note, and this is over fibromyalgia. And fibromyalgia is pretty much a chronic inflammatory disorder of the muscular system. They're not really sure why it's caused yet, and they use some anti-depression drugs as an actual treatment for the fibromyalgia. Now, if you talk to some docs aren't even sure that fibromyalgia exists. However, I think most of the clinical indications that we're seeing these days have well proved that fibromyalgia does exist, and one, and two, that it is an actual disease. So as we're learning more and more about this new upcoming disease, we will see them create various types of medicines for them. But if you're muscles were inflamed at the tendons all the time. Does it make sense that that would give you continuous pain from various parts of your body? And this is 9.0. This is aging and the muscular system, and these are just some generals here. General reduction in the size and power of all muscles. That's because a 90-year-old male is not going to be as strong as he was whenever he was 20. Skeletal muscles become smaller. Skeletal muscles become less elastic. You lose some of your flexibility. Exercise tolerance is decreased, so you cannot go out and run 5 miles anymore unless you've kept yourself conditioned. The ability to recover from muscular injury decreases. So if you actually tear a muscle, it takes a longer time for the muscle actually to repair itself and heal itself. And this is the interaction, the area that I told you all to always look at. These are the interaction of the muscles with the other systems in the body. Integument, skin, skeletal, nervous system, which all smooth and autonomic muscles. Endocrine system, which we're going to see the hormones cascade out and tell multiple receptor sites simultaneously to work. The cardiovascular system, which is made primarily from muscles. Lymphatics, immune, respiratory, which is the lungs. Digestive, which has muscles in it itself. Urinary system, which would have muscles in it, including the bladder. And then the reproductive system. So all of these systems, please look over their interactions with other systems and the interaction of the muscular system with all these other systems. And this concludes Chapter 7. If you have any questions over this, feel free to call area code 405-219-7613, or you can email me at smithr@imsa.net. Thank you.